So good afternoon. I hope everyone's enjoying the conference. This is my first Triangle InfoSecCon. I'm pretty blown away. I've been to some other ISSA conferences, and this is like a legit conference. I mean, it's amazing, the turnout, the level of speakers, and the food and everything else has been great. So hope you're enjoying the conference, and I hope you get something out of my presentation. So the title is Optimal Offensive Security Programs. So this talk was inspired by one of the organizations I worked at. I was a red team lead in the organization, and sometimes when you work in a certain area, IT or security, you take for granted that people know what you're talking about. And we see that a lot when we're communicating with the board in different business groups, that they don't understand that, so we need to be on the same page. So the inspiration with this talk was to be able to relay to the rest of the people on the security team the difference between a vulnerability assessment, vulnerability management, pen testing, and red team operations. And it was kind of interesting. One of the things that didn't really come to mind, I really didn't realize until the first part of this year, was I knew the people in the organization didn't know the difference between a true red team, and then I come to figure out later on, it was actually the CISO didn't know the difference, because I got hired on to run a red team, build a red team, but we were just doing a bunch of pen testing. So the person I thought that knew what it was really didn't, so it was interesting. And I've got a single slide in here that's just like the slide I created at that organization to show the difference between the different assessments. And this information is important because whether you're working on the blue team or you're hiring pen testers or working with pen testers, it's a good idea to be on the same page. Some terms are used interchangeably, and as long as you understand the different versions of that, it's going to make you a better consumer and make it easier for you when you're working with offensive security teams. So a little bit about my background. I'm an offensive security expert and evangelist, so I do a lot of speaking on pen testing, because one of the things that I can say about pen testing and offensive security is really not a wonder that people don't understand that area. It's such a small piece of what you do in cybersecurity, but it has a major impact. For instance, when I used to work for US Bank, we had 13 pen testers internally, and we had like 1,000 overall in the security group. And also kind of build on some of the importance of another good fact from that too was, even though we had 13 people on our team, we're only able to get through half of our PCI pen testing. So I've been in offensive security for over 20 years in cybersecurity. When I started out, I was on the data security team, so the names have kind of changed since then. Things have gotten a lot more complex. Back then, security was so much easier, although we had less complex and effective tools back then, because EDR back in 2004 was just like antivirus, so we had very limited tools whenever we were fighting malware and different things like that. When NIMDA was out, when I was a sysadmin, we had to do all that manually. So that it's evolved, and the good thing is we've got the tools, but it kind of does make managing and understanding this a little more complex. So I'm also a former adjunct instructor, and I continue to teach pen testing. I used to teach pen testing, web app pen testing at Dallas College, and I still continue to teach workshops. I'm the concept creator and the co-author of the Pen Tester Blueprint. So this is a book that came from my lecture at Dallas College that I gave my students each semester, which turned into a conference talk and then eventually a book. Was featured in the Tribe of Hackers Red Team book, and that's how I got the opportunity to write for Wylie Publishing. And I'm the host of the Phillip, Wylie Show, and previously the Hacker Factory podcast, which the Hacker Factory podcast last year won a SANS Difference Makers Award in the podcast category for that. And so the agenda, we're going to discuss offensive security, the different types of offensive security approaches, identifying gaps in offensive security programs, and strategies for optimizing and overcoming the gaps in offensive security. So this talk is actually kind of a updated talk, or I added the part about the gaps. I originally gave the previous talk at Blackout Middle East and Africa last year, but I saw the need to add in some of the gaps, because you can learn about the different assessment types, but it's a good idea too to know where some of the shortcomings are to hopefully overcome those. So an introduction to offensive security. So offensive security is assessing the security from a threat actor perspective or a malicious hacker. So you hear in the news, these hackers in nation states, different malicious hackers are breaching these organizations. So there's not a better way to assess the security than using the same mindset, tools, and techniques that they're using. And some of these techniques is more common that you see and kind of pretty obvious to most is the computer hacking piece. But there's also physical security testing, because you can have the most secure environment, but if someone's able to get into a data center of a server that's been logged into, they've got whatever level access without actually be able to hack. And then social engineering, which is one of the ways that threat actors are using for footholds, that's very popular by threat actors, and one of the things that you need to take in consideration when you're performing your pen test. So offensive security and vulnerability management. So vulnerability management and offensive security kind of complement each other. So when you're doing your pen tests, some companies can't do it frequent enough. When you're only doing a pen test once a year, you've got to do something in between. You have to run some kind of testing between your patching cycles. You know, a new patch Tuesday comes out, you update all your systems. You really need to make sure you go behind and validate that those patches have been applied. And so also part of that process is also the remediation and patching piece. So different types of assessment targets, and this is just growing. Some of these points here from my original pen tester blueprint talk, and some of the things that's been added more recently is AI. Now, since we have AI being more widely used, before, you know, it's been around for a long time, but we didn't have access to it. Now we have access to it. Threat actors have access to it, so we need to be able to test those environments and make sure we're secure. And just one of the things here that be interesting after the talk, if anyone has any experience in this area, if you stop by the Horizon 3 booth, I'd like to see if you've worked in this area. But one of the things that really come to mind recently with AI, that if you're in digital forensics or going to school, I would really learn generative AI, because when you're doing investigations on digital forensics, then now, before you're collecting social media accounts, email accounts, and data from phones, mobile devices, tablets, and computers, but now you have that forensics data that's going to be in ChatGPT or whatever different types of AI products, because now people are using it, sometimes putting PII in there, intellectual property, so this stuff's getting in those. So it's one of the areas I really see growing for digital forensics is someone that really knows that AI area, you know, learning that, taking that along with your digital forensic skills would be very helpful. But all these different targets, and this is going to change. There's things we don't know about now that will come out in 5 years, technologies that need to be tested. We need to consider all those things. One of the things that have been overlooked for years was even like medical devices. People think, who would harm a medical device or hurt someone through their medical device? But it's, you know, someone can assassinate a world leader, and it's easier than being a sniper or something like that, easier to gain access to them remotely by attacking an insulin pump or a pacemaker. So for the longest time, these medical device companies weren't requiring it, but one of the things that's happened now is FDA is requiring that these are tested, which is good. Before, in the past, we trusted everyone, we created technology, and security was an afterthought, but we need to make sure that we're including that from the development phase. It's harder. If anyone has worked in application security, you can attest that it's harder to go back and fix those things later on. So we need to keep this in mind with all these things, and keep in mind the different technologies in your environment that may need to be assessed. In physical security, even outside of your data center or access to your building, if you're a telecom company or maybe some kind of energy provider and you have work trucks, then you want to make sure that those type of assets are protected as well, because there's sometimes expensive equipment, telecom equipment, cable and different things, copper wire, you know, people are stealing copper wire, so making sure that's secure so someone can't steal your vehicles or any of the information or stuff that you use within that practice. So different types of offensive security approaches. So vulnerability management is not truly offensive security, but it's a important part of that whole cybersecurity tech stack. So vulnerability assessments, penetration testing, and red teaming and adversary, also known as adversary emulation. So anytime you see job requirements, it said VAPT, vulnerability assessment is part of that, and pen testing is the second part of that. So if you ever see those terminologies, VAPT is vulnerability assessment and pen testing. So there's times that you do, sometimes it's better to do a vulnerability assessment than as a pen test, and we'll get into that here soon. So vulnerability management is a cyclical process of identifying vulnerabilities and remediating those vulnerabilities. Also, patching is part of your vulnerability management program. And one of the things that gets overlooked sometimes is your asset inventory. So if you don't know of what assets you have, it's hard to defend and hard to assess. So if you're not keeping up with your asset inventory, you could be doing your vulnerability scans and be missing out on several systems that are critical. holding critical data or something that could be exploited to gain access to systems that do have critical data. So vulnerability assessments, this is like a step further than vulnerability management. So with this, you're validating the vulnerabilities, because vulnerability scanners will find false positives. There could be a case where you find a vulnerability that vulnerability scanner says is exploitable or is critical, but there may be mitigating controls in place that prevent it from being exploited. And sometimes, so you really need to make sure that you're going a step further, validating these vulnerabilities, because a lot of times these vulnerability scanners are just looking for signatures, the version of the operating system, the version of the software running, and that's where it defines whether it's vulnerable or not. So the only way to really do that is validating those vulnerabilities, doing something like a vulnerability assessment. And some of the ways you can validate the vulnerabilities is either manually testing or using other tools. In some cases, organizations or consulting companies will use 2 vulnerability scanners. So they'll run Nessus and then like OpenVIS or something like that, because there's times you may find a vulnerability with one scanner that the other one doesn't detect. And I had an instance where I was testing an online retailer, and I was doing an on-site pen test, and I found something in their organization that Rapid7 Nexpose didn't find. I was using Nessus. And that's not to say one's better than the other, it's just sometimes they'll find certain vulnerabilities sooner than the other one does. They add those CVEs sooner to that scanner. So also one of the things you're doing is some of the tools you're using is some other hacking tools, but we're not at this point doing any hacking. Nessus has a lot of auxiliary modules. Nmap does too as well, that you can look for vulnerabilities and do further testing. Like one of my favorite tools within Nmap is the NSE script called Vuln. And so you use Vuln, it works like a vulnerability scanner. It works a little bit faster than Nessus does. So you're using a combination of these tools, doing manual validation. And one of the things you do, you're not exploiting, but one of the things that you can do to go a step further in making your vulnerability assessment more effective is go on some site like ExploitDB and do some research on other sites and look to see if it's exploitable. And if it's exploitable, you can notate that in a report, and it may require later on doing a pen test to validate if it's exploitable or not. So that's an extra step that you can take to give more value to that report. So penetration testing, this is similar to the vulnerability assessment. You're using manual testing techniques, you're using vulnerability scanners, you're validating the vulnerabilities, you're doing your research to see if it's exploitable, then you're actually exploiting it to see if you can gain a foothold in that environment. Is it exploitable or not? And then if you're able to gain foothold, are you able to do post-exploitation, gain access to sensitive data and so forth from that? And so there's times that a vulnerability assessment might be required over a pen test. One time I was testing a hospital chain, doing a Wi-Fi pen test. I did my scanning, and one of the things I noticed when I looked on my scan results, watching it scan through the Wi-Fi network, that I was noticing medical devices connected to that Wi-Fi network. And this is like in the emergency room and operating rooms that this was connected. So I went back to the CISO and I said, I found these vulnerabilities, but we're with these systems, but we really want to make sure, I really don't want to hack those systems because I wouldn't want to cause any harm to anyone or take any critical systems out. So we just pivoted to doing a vulnerability assessment, and then we did like a configuration review of the wireless controllers and access points. That way we give pretty close to what you'd get from a pen test, getting all the major items, but doing it in a safe manner. Sometimes your OT environments, you may want to be careful there, ICS, that you don't want to take down any systems that are critical. So sometimes a vulnerability assessment is the best choice. And so the different types of testing methods, so most of the cases, what you're going to see that a threat actor is doing, nation state, script kiddie, is they're doing a black box approach. So little to no details, and on a pen test, you're doing little to, it's also known as a blind pen test, so you're little to no details on it. So I did a pen test one time that was more of a red team operation, a black box pen test. So we only had the physical address of the company because physical security was in scope. So during our testing, I was able to find all the IP addresses and subnet blocks, domain names, did subdomain enumeration. We did our testing, and then I did OSINT. So I used Shodan to go through and see if I could find any vulnerabilities. And I did find a FTP server in Indonesia, which is clear text authentication, and kind of a risk to have exposed the internet. You want to be using SFTP or some other secure file transfer method or file download method. But I was able to find that. If I hadn't done the reconnaissance, I wouldn't have found that. And when you're doing a pen test, if you have a thorough scope, you shouldn't miss items, but the black box approach, you're very limited. You don't have all the targets in place that you're testing, so you may miss out there. And white box, crystal box, also known as assumed breach, this is more detailed information. So for like applications, you've got credentials for each level of access, you've got source code to do static code analysis, to be able to test it more thoroughly. And that's been very common on the application side, but one of the things that's come about is the assumed breach model for networks. And what this does, this kind of helps you with your ransomware readiness, because one of the things, if you get sent an email and you click on it and it's got ransomware or some kind of malware on there, it's got the same level of access of the user that executes that malware. And then even once that attacker gains access, they can elevate privileges and go even further. But if you're not doing an assumed breach test, you're going to miss out on those items if you don't make a foothold. Traditionally, companies would go in, do a pen test, doing a black box approach. If they couldn't gain a foothold, then they'd write up the report and it looked like the company was really secure, but it didn't take in effect ransomware, insider threats. You hear of nation states implanting people within organizations to steal intellectual property. You probably heard recently, not long ago, KnowBe4, they were infiltrated by people from North Korea that was actually working for them remotely in organizations. They had all these laptops set up in one place. You hear of hardware manufacturers that other nation states implants their people within that organization to steal that intellectual property. Once you have authorized access, it's easier to gain data, so it makes it easier for threat actors. And so this is a very worthwhile approach to use. I think the first company I heard using that, but I don't think they were the first, was Red Siege. And like I said, a lot of companies going in trying to do that initial foothold and not getting in. And gray box is kind of in between. Gray box is kind of the terminology can kind of change here. You can have a black box pen test with a defined scope, so you have all the IP addresses in its well-defined scope. And the benefit to the white box or gray box is having that complete scope. Otherwise, you may miss out on assets. You may totally miss things and you don't want to do that, so you make sure you have a complete list of assets that you're wanting to test within that. And a good approach to take too is, if you're doing a pen test, start out with the black box approach. Try to hack in like a threat actor would. If you can't gain access, then go to an assumed breach model. So red teaming, this is the process of using tactics, techniques, and procedures, or TTPs, that a real world threat actor would use. A lot of cases you're using like MITRE ATT&CK to look at some common TTPs that the different APT groups are using. A good way to test that is look at the industry you're in. Find the type of threat actors is targeting your industry, and then perform your red team operation based on that. So red team operation varies, the true definition varies from a pen test. With a pen test, you're looking for all the vulnerabilities that are exploitable, exploiting all those and trying to do post-exploitation. With the red team operation, you're going in unannounced. There's a control group, usually the CISO is a member of the control group, maybe someone on the board or different management that know about this, so that way they know it's not a true breach. And one of the best outcomes of one of these types of tests was this company had an incident response company on retainer. So if they were ever suspicious that they're being breached, they would bring in this company to investigate, try to contain, and remove the threat actor from that environment. So this red team operation's going on. The blue team manager calls up the CISO and say, hey, currently looks like we're being attacked. We brought in the incident response team to detect that. So maybe the red team did get a foothold, but that's an A+ on your credit card, on your report card, because you're able to detect it. Part of red teaming is also testing the blue team. You're testing the response, not only just the technology capabilities, because that's where pen testing is mainly the technology people if you're doing social engineering, but it's a good way you think about incident response plans or incident response exercises, and or actually doing your business continuity type of tests and disaster recovery. You test those, you test your backups, you test your recoverability, but one of the things people don't think about sometimes is testing your incident response plan. That's what a red team exercise does. So you're testing the people, the technology, the response, and along with this, you're testing all those items, and you're picking like one entry point. You're finding one way to get a foothold in. With a pen test, you're looking for multiple ways, and you're trying to emulate threat actors. You can use MITRE ATT&CK, and then you can also get more creative and find different attacks and chain together, create your own TTP to do during the testing. So one of the things to make sure, I mean, you see a lot of vendors that will call their product or what they do red teaming, but that's not true red teaming. The thing is you just need to understand what you're communicating. Do you want an adversary emulation, or do you want a pen test and understanding and be on the same page? That way, if you're talking to a vendor, that you're not getting the wrong thing. The company I worked at that didn't understand the different types of offensive security assessments, we had a director there that wanted a red team operation done against the SAP app. You don't do red team operations against applications, it's against overall infrastructures and people. It's not, so understanding you can end up paying a lot more for assessment and not getting out what out of it that your goals are, and so you want to make sure that you're on the same page. So here's the slide that I was talking about that I created for the organization. And so you see some similarities across all of it. So you're doing some kind of discovery across all of it. When you get into vulnerability assessments, pen testing, and red teaming, this is more commonly called reconnaissance. During your reconnaissance, you use open source intelligence, but asset discovery on the vulnerability management side, this is using tools like Axonius to discover what all's in your environment that needs to be pen tested, and just keeping an inventory of it. Because there's cases where you have shadow IT, now it's even more critical to watch out for shadow IT because people can spin up stuff, in containers or in the cloud. It's a lot easier. At one time back when I was in IT, you had to have physical hardware, bring it on site, you had to install operating system. Now you got someone in marketing could go to Amazon Cloud or whatever, or Azure, and spin something up easily. So you need to make sure you're doing that asset inventory. And once you have that complete inventory, you keep that up to date, and then you do your vulnerability scanning. And then once you've done your vulnerability scanning, you remediate and repeat that process. And also patching is part of that process. So vulnerability assessment, you're doing your reconnaissance, vulnerability scanning, manual testing, and vulnerability validation. So this part we haven't got into the exploitation piece, the hacking. And then the penetration testing, you're taking it one step further and trying to see if you can do any exploitation or post-exploitation. And then red teaming, you're trying to go undetected. Sometimes there's misconceptions about pen testing, saying that you're supposed to go undetected. There's some cases where you may try to do that for a limited time, but pen testing is also referred to as a time box test. You're so limited on time, and that's going to depend on whether you're doing that from an internal resource or consulting company. When I was consulting, we may have 40 hours to test an environment, whereas an internal resource, we had 4 weeks. And that's a lot of difference. With the 4 weeks, you should be able to do more testing. So you're just so limited on time, you're really not worrying about the detection. You're just trying to thoroughly test that environment. With a red team operation, you're trying to emulate a threat actor, so you're trying to go undetected. So your reconnaissance methods require you to be more quiet. You have to kind of avoid things like vulnerability scanners because you will typically get detected. But one of the things with the detection is not all the case, and one of the things to kind of show people, you really need to tune your endpoints to make sure you're detecting these things. Because I did the pen test I was talking about where I found the SFTP server in Indonesia. We went on site to do the physical pen test. Once we got in, we had 1 day to complete the testing. So we weren't really worried about being quiet. So I was running Nessus, I was running Responder, all these different tools in the background that should have been detected. Was able to exploit one of the systems, and people think sometimes that you don't still see XP in Windows 2000. This was in 2018, but XP was still in the environment. It was a chemical company. So I was able to exploit that system and gain a foothold, create an account on that system. So that company, an interesting thing was they had a really knowledgeable CISO. They were constantly training their employees. They didn't detect me until 12 hours later after I was gone. And so this is one of the importance when to do things to try to work on your detection, to make sure you're detecting these things, because you can have all the best of class tools, but if they're not tuned right, you're going to miss out on a lot. And so identifying gaps in offensive security programs. So just to kind of give you a little history and why we see a lot of these gaps is when pen testing started out, it was more open scope. Pen testers were using social engineering, physical pen testing, pretty much everything was on the table. But then PCI pen testing come along, which really helped grow the industry, brought awareness to pen testing because a lot of companies weren't having pen tests performed. So this really helped it scale, because I remember when I was at my first pen testing job, I would go to our local cybersecurity club meetings, security groups, and different conferences. I would go there may be only 2 other pen testers there, 2 or 3 other pen testers. But now in Dallas, you go to events around there's quite a few. So the compliance industry really helped drive the growth for pen testing. But one of the things it also did is it opened up a lot of gaps, because these different pen testing types weren't being done. So things were being missed, environments were being missed. So some of the limitations is assessment frequency. So pen testing, a security posture is a snapshot. It's a time box approach. So you only have an idea of the vulnerabilities at that point. Every time you add more users, more applications, make configuration changes, you're possibly putting vulnerabilities that are exploitable into your environment. So you need to be constantly testing this. And a good story I like to share for the reason for frequent pen testing, one of my consulting jobs, we were doing a pen test for this company. Fortunately, they had a 90-day retest. So I was in there doing the pen test, found some highs, criticals, and lows. So when I came back 90 days later, I was running my vulnerability scans and noticed the criticals, highs, lows, and mediums were all remediated. But during that 90 days, someone figured out how to exploit one of those low criticality vulnerabilities. So if they hadn't brought us back to do a retest, then that system would have laid vulnerable for at least a year. So once a year, a lot of companies do it once a year, maybe twice a year, but that's really not frequent enough. And this is where things like vulnerability management can help fill the gaps, because you need something going on between. Ideally, you want something like continuous pen testing or very frequent pen testing. So like time between these tests are just opportunities for the bad guys. So overlooked methods, this is another thing, like physical security controls. Sometimes this gets missed. Companies don't think about getting physical pen tests done. And as I mentioned earlier, this is critical to like any kind of resources the company owns, even outside of digital assets. You have files, the paper files that you may have within your organization. So social engineering, so this is used a lot by threat actors. A lot of breaches are available because of social engineering. This is the main way threat actors are getting a foothold. So red teaming gets overlooked a lot. And then assume breach assessments. Not all companies are doing this, but I see a trend where more companies are starting to do that. And purple teaming, also known as security controls validation, this is one of my favorite new type of assessments or exercises. So the blue team and the red team or the offensive team get together and they execute tools to see if it's detected. So that way you're able to go through, if a certain tool is detected, you can tune your endpoints to detect those. And as you tune those systems, you're taking out of the hands of threat actors possible tools. So you may not prevent a nation state, but you're eliminating certain classes of threat actors and reducing that attack surface, because as you do your vulnerability management, pen test, do the reoccurring testing and remediation, it takes a while for your organization to mature. And so adding these purple team exercises is a good way to help the maturity of the tools that are available for threat actors to use in that environment. And so some other overlooked limitations or overlooked environments is wireless networks, cloud, IoT environments. With a lot of these, a lot of people overlook the wireless, but the thing that's risky about wireless is someone with a high power Wi-Fi antenna, from a mile away can hack your organization. When I worked for one company, we used to do war drives as part of our Wi-Fi pen test, and it basically would give us how far the Wi-Fi signal could be detected. And the antennas I was using wasn't super high power, but I could pick up Wi-Fi signals from half a mile away. So there's even more powerful antennas you could use, but we kind of finally got away from that because we really figured if your Wi-Fi is accessible outside of your environment, it's going to be a risk no matter how far, because someone can pull up in your parking lot or use a high-powered antenna and gain access, or either set a drone on top of your environment with a Wi-Fi network card in it and do reconnaissance. And cloud's another area people look at, because especially the risk of the cloud itself, you want to protect that data, but when you're doing a hybrid environment, sometimes people could, if you're using Azure, it could be leveraged to gain access to your internal Microsoft environment. So strategies to overcome gaps in offensive security. So one of the main things is increase pen test frequency. So you see a lot of these options out there that are continuous pen testing or more frequent. The continuous is really your best option to be continuously testing. Some of the things that can fill these gaps is vulnerability scanning. Your vulnerability assessments help somewhat, but not as optimal as performing frequent pen testing. So you want to implement automation or autonomous pen testing to improve the scalability and frequency. And then implement bug bounties and instant and responsible disclosure programs. So this way your applications are constantly being tested. because one of the things this advantage this brings too is you may be having annual network or annual application pen tests done, but the good thing about bug bounties is one of the ways I like to describe bug bounty compared to pen testing. So bug bounties are crowdsourced pen testing. And one of the things you'll find with bug bounty hunters, they don't get paid unless they find bugs. If you're a pen tester, you're gonna get paid regardless. And most pen testers try to find vulnerabilities, but the bug hunters have to try harder. One of the ways I describe the kind of ways to describe it is if you think of someone that fishes for sport compared to someone that fishes to feed themselves. The person that has to feed themselves by fishing is going to be a lot more successful because the person that is doing it for sport, they're going to go home and eat a steak if they're unsuccessful. So this is the same thing with the bug hunters, and you're having pen tests done 365 days a year, however long you're letting the bug bounty run. You've got hundreds of thousands of security researchers, and they specialize in certain vulnerabilities. So someone might be really good at cross-site scripting or SQL injection, and that's what they focus on. And they're even using automation. So any of the bug bounty programs they're on, they're feeding into their system that's constantly scanning, doing their reconnaissance, and when they get up the next day to start their bug hunting, this information is collected and they can start digging deeper on that, trying to find vulnerabilities. So this is kind of a really good thing to add, and then having like a responsible disclosure, so that way if someone finds bugs, they can report it. Some researchers are kind of scared because companies will try to sue them. Even there's been some companies with responsible disclosure and they got hacked. Like there was a drone company that this happened to. Fortunately, it worked out. The security researchers didn't get sued, but they had a bug bounty. They found some bugs, and sometimes organizations don't want these bugs revealed, but you really want. I mean, they did a responsible disclosure. They didn't show it, release it to the public. It was internal, so they did it responsibly. And so overlooked methods, so social engineering, including phishing campaigns. What we see traditionally, a lot of companies are doing phishing campaigns, but what they're doing is they're using these different tools that do these automated phishing campaigns, and it's through their email security or whatever. But the downside to that is what it's doing is it's only testing clicks, it's testing security awareness. It's not testing what happens if you have a payload, malware or ransomware in there, it gets clicked on. So you make sure you're doing ransomware test, or you want to do phishing campaigns with a payload. So a lot of these tools you use, you can put like a JavaScript in there using payloads to test it. So you want to make sure you're doing that. And one of the things too that you'll run into is, I know over the years some of my colleagues in cybersecurity and IT that we would know the provider of the phishing emails, and we'd put a rule in anytime you see something from KnowBe4 or Proofpoint or whatever, that it would sit there and send it to the trash, so that way you didn't have to mess with it, you didn't accidentally click on something. So those are too easy to be gamed, so you really need to do more manual phishing campaigns. And then also you want to do red team operations, also known as adversary emulations, physical controls, and the purple teaming, also known as control validation. And purple teaming can be done with a breach and attack simulation tool, or you can use, like Atomic Red Team has some scripts out there that are free that you can run against your environment. And one of the things nice about the Atomic Red Team scripts is they don't have a payload, and it's just got a signature to see if they're being detected. So if you're running Mimikatz, you don't have to worry about your team accidentally downloading cleartext creds or using other payloads, vulnerabilities with payloads that could cause harm in your systems. And so missing environments, wireless networks, cloud, IoT, and this is also too with your wireless networks, some of your different IoT technologies outside of just Wi-Fi. And that concludes the presentation. And feel free to connect with me. That QR code there has a list to all my different resources. And for those that are interested in pen testing, I've got a complete semester of my lectures from Dallas College on pen testing, which was based on the Pen Test Plus manual. So that is under one of my playlists on there, the Ethical Hacking and System Defense playlist. And check out my podcast. So I have a lot of well-known people from the industry and not so well-known, especially if you're just starting out. There's some really good stories on there to motivate you and encourage you on your cybersecurity career. Thank you. Anyone have any questions?
If you're not going to do automation, how
I would say ideally, most people do, if you could do it quarterly, if you're not doing it continuous or automated, and then if you're not able to do, depending on the frequency, then make sure you're doing something like vulnerability management and scanning in between. But quarterly is better than not doing it continuous. But yeah, something like that, leveraging your vulnerability management. Good question. Anyone else? Okay. Go ahead and get a picture. So if you can't think of any questions, you can come by later. I'll be hanging out with the Horizon 3 folks, and also we're giving away copies of my book. So I'll be giving away copies of my book over there. We got a limited amount, so if you want to stop by there, we'll be giving out the books. Thank you.